Welcome back, everyone, to Occult Archives. We are about to dive into another one of history's most intriguing and, let's be honest, sometimes downright scary books.
They definitely have a reputation. Some for good reason, others, well, maybe not so much.
This time around, we're exploring the Infinite Perspectus from the Unarius Academy of Science. It's a book that really pushes the boundaries of what we typically think of as, you know, science.
It definitely goes beyond your typical textbook. Claims to offer a whole science of cosmic evolution and interdimensional consciousness. It's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is how it starts off by suggesting that even things that seem destructive or negative actually have this like underlying creative energy driving them.
Right. Kind of like, how a forest fire can be devastating, but it also clears the way for new growth. The infinite perspectus takes this idea and applies it to, well, pretty much everything. It argues that at the most fundamental level, all energy is seeking to express itself, to create and transform.
Okay. And it goes on to suggest that even our own like everyday anxieties, the feeling of being watched or judged, could be traced back to these like deeply ingrained beliefs from childhood, maybe even past lives.
It specifically mentions this idea of adults being grown-up children still carrying this subconscious fear of a divine observer, which the book links to certain religious teachings. So it's like we're still carrying these anxieties even though, logically, we know better.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, think about how many people still have those little superstitious habits like knocking on wood or crossing their fingers,
Yeah.
maybe without even realizing where it comes from.
The infinite perspectus suggests that those things might actually be what it calls psychic inversions carried over from past lives.
Wow. So these seemingly insignificant things could actually be echoes of ancient rituals or practices.
That's what the book proposes, and it gets even more interesting when it starts talking about the nature of the mind. It basically rejects the idea that our mental and physical selves are separate, describing the physical mind as an extrusion of the psychic anatomy. It's like saying our brain is the hardware and our psychic anatomy is the software running the show.
And then it goes on to say that a lot of the spiritual practices we see today, things like, intense concentration, praying to deities, even just visualizing our desires, are actually forms of what it calls witchcraft.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the more controversial parts of the book. It claims that those practices are essentially trying to manipulate the physical world from the outside in, rather than tapping into a deeper source of power. It argues that true power originates in these higher dimensions, the fourth or fifth, as a result of a kind of collaboration between the superconscious self, which it describes as a polarized abstraction of the infinite, and the various levels of our mental and subconscious being.
So it's like we're trying to force things to happen instead of aligning ourselves with this natural flow of energy.
Exactly. The infinite perspectus puts a lot of emphasis on correct action, which it defines as, well, not really action at all, but more like allowing the infinite to flow through us and manifest in our lives as clear perspectives and, in some cases, even what we might call miracles. And it doesn't shy away from suggesting those miracles are achievable, even things like telepathy and connecting with higher spiritual realms.
Now, speaking of miracles, the book also takes a pretty different view on psychiatry. It uses the example of someone being afraid of mice. The traditional approach might be to look for a traumatic event in their childhood. But the infinite perspectus suggests that this fear could actually be a carryover from a past life. Like maybe they were attacked by a much larger animal in a previous existence, and that fear is just kind of, echoing into their current life.
Yeah, it's like saying that our phobias and anxieties might not always have a direct explanation in our current life. They could be rooted in experiences from other lifetimes. It's a pretty radical concept compared to traditional psychology.
And this idea of past lives influencing our present fears is applied to a lot of other things too, like the common fear of snakes, for instance.
Right. The infinite perspectus links that fear not only to potential encounters with, poisonous snakes in this life, but also to religious symbolism that portrays snakes as, symbols of temptation or evil. It's like this combination of personal experience across lifetimes and cultural narratives weaving together to create this deep-seated fear in our subconscious.
And that brings us to what I think is one of the most fascinating ideas in the infinite perspectus. This notion that everything we do, even our subconscious bodily functions, is essentially a reflection of energy waveforms emanating from our psychic anatomy.
It's like saying our whole life is a kind of energy signature, a complex pattern of waves that carry the imprint of all our past experiences, including those from other lifetimes.
And the book claims that understanding these energy patterns, which it calls diagrams and descriptions, holds the key to understanding the true nature of life. It even hints at a more advanced second lesson course, where these patterns are explored in detail. It's almost like saying there's a hidden code to reality that we can unlock if we learn to read these energy signatures.
It definitely makes you wonder what else is out there beyond our current level of perception. And then the book throws another curveball by arguing that even our fear of death, which most people consider, a negative thing, is actually a crucial driving force in our evolution.
Right. It suggests that this fear motivates us to seek meaning and understanding beyond our physical limitations, ultimately leading us to recognize the existence of these higher spiritual realms. It's like saying that fear, in a way, pushes us towards a greater awareness of the unseen dimensions of reality.
It's a pretty interesting take on something that's usually seen as, purely negative. And the book goes on to say that fear in general acts as this kind of libido or driving force in our lives. That is, until we reach a level of intelligence where we can navigate life without needing that constant push from our anxieties.
It's like saying fear is a kind of training wheel that eventually comes off as we evolve. And then we get into the whole idea of reincarnation. The infinite Perspectus describes it as a period where our consciousness is, in essence, suspended from our earthly existence. And this suspension causes the expressions of our past lives to become out of phase with our current reality.
And that's where the subconscious comes in. The book describes it as this reconstructive entity that tries to harmonize those past and present experiences. But if those past experiences are unresolved or traumatic, it can create a lot of tension in our lives.
And that tension can build up over multiple lifetimes, manifesting as what the book calls negative psychic shocks. It even suggests that larger societal issues like, wars and global conflicts could be the result of these unresolved issues from our collective past.
It's like saying we're all carrying the baggage of history, both individually and collectively, and that until we address those underlying issues, they'll continue to manifest in our lives in different forms.
Now, speaking of baggage, the book also has a lot to say about religion. It claims that many religious forms are actually just disconnected from a true understanding of the universe, and in many cases are actually hindering our spiritual progress.
It encourages us to identify and essentially cancel out these obsolete thought patterns from past lives that are no longer serving our growth. It's like saying we need to do a serious mental decluttering and get rid of those outdated beliefs that are holding us back.
And when it comes to Christianity, the infinite Perspectus takes a, well, let's just say an unconventional approach.
It definitely throws out a lot of the traditional interpretations.
Yeah, it presents the mission of Jesus as this paradoxical one. Instead of reinforcing the traditional God concept, it argues that Jesus came to dismantle it and replace it with the Christ principle.
Which it describes as the Father within, this inherent potential for divine consciousness that exists in all of us.
And it even goes on to say that the traditional Christian idea of Jesus as the Christ Savior actually takes away from that personal responsibility for our own spiritual growth.
It's like it's saying that by relying on an external savior figure, we're kind of bypassing the whole process of developing our own inner divinity. It's a pretty bold critique of, one of the most fundamental beliefs in Christianity.
The infinite Perspectus doesn't just stop there. It goes on to point out all the contradictions in our modern world. Despite all our technological advancements, there's still so much stress, conflict, and just general unease in society.
And it specifically calls out Sigmund Freud's psychology, labeling it as false and sterile. It argues that his whole emphasis on sex as the primary driver of human behavior is, well, completely off base.
Yeah, it offers a totally different perspective on instinct.
Yeah.
Instead of just being about, procreation or social behavior, it suggests that instinct is actually a carryover from our past lives, these ingrained patterns that we bring with us from lifetime to lifetime.
And it points to ancient Chinese knowledge about prenatal life and reincarnation to support this idea. It's like saying we're not born with blank slates after all.
So the advice from the infinite Perspectus is basically to avoid getting stuck in any limited point of view, whether it's, Freud, Jung, Einstein, Newton, whoever. Instead, it encourages us to adopt this, what it calls infinitely minded approach, to cultivate an unlimited horizon through introspection and exploring the principles laid out in the book.
It's really advocating for a much more expansive and open way of seeing ourselves and the universe.
And the book is very clear about the potential dangers of misusing scientific or philosophical ideas,
Hmm.
using the example of how Newton's mathematical discoveries were manipulated by the Inquisition.
Right. It's a reminder that knowledge without wisdom can be a really dangerous thing.
And this brings us to another really fascinating concept from the infinite Perspectus, psychokinetics. It describes it as the ability to not only receive higher intelligence, but also to use and direct it in a constructive way.
And it claims that this ability was a known reality in ancient Lemuria and formed the basis for a lot of the practices we now associate with, magic, witchcraft, and even religion.
And here's where things get really interesting. It even talks about the ability to read people by tuning into their sine wave frequencies.
Yeah, it actually describes demonstrations where they were able to reveal personal details about complete strangers. It's a pretty mind-blowing concept if you think about it.
It then compares relying on prayer for guidance to praying for a car to drive itself. It argues that the more effective approach is to actually gain the knowledge needed to, steer your own life in the direction you want to go.
It's really emphasizing the importance of personal agency and understanding. It's like saying, don't just sit back and hope for a miracle. Get out there and learn how to create your own destiny.
And even those seemingly miraculous events the infinite Perspectus suggests are actually just the result of scientific principles at work. It even reinterprets Jesus' statements about faith as referring to an individual's inherent capacity for creation and the principle of the Father within. It's like saying that the power to create miracles doesn't come from some external deity, but from within ourselves.
And it goes on to suggest that those who experience these miraculous transformations were actually preconditioned through spiritual experiences in between lifetimes, actively seeking out individuals like Jesus to complete that spiritual connection and manifest physical healing.
Now, speaking of the church, the infinite Perspectus is pretty critical of organized religion, accusing it of perpetuating this fantasy of divine intervention in every aspect of our lives. It even goes on to suggest that the church hierarchy has this what it calls fanatical power to basically control earthly existence through these deistic configurations that they manage. It's a pretty harsh critique.
It definitely doesn't hold back.
And while it doesn't deny the existence of miracles, it questions their value without a proper understanding of the evolutionary principles at play. It even suggests that the greatest miracle we can pray for is the miracle of understanding the infinite.
And it claims that this understanding will eventually lead to a kind of a diminished need for prayer as we evolve towards a more intelligent and proactive approach to life.
And this is where the infinite Perspectus really starts to go in a completely different direction. It points to what it calls the greatest single compromising effort to maintain Christian influence, the concept of Jesus as God incarnate.
It's like they're saying that this idea was kind of a late addition to Christian doctrine, maybe even a way to, reinforce the church's authority.
It dismisses this idea as new lunacy, pointing out that logically, a being intelligent enough to create the universe wouldn't suddenly need to come down to earth and start, converting people. It just doesn't make sense.
Right. It's like if you're already the creator of everything, why would you need to go around trying to convince everyone that you exist?
So the infinite Perspectus offers this alternative explanation for the life of Jesus, referring to him as Mr. X. It suggests that an advanced spiritual entity was essentially using the body of an ordinary earthman, Mr. A, to, teach and perform these so-called miracles. It's like a kind of temporary takeover, with the earthman occasionally stepping aside to let this higher being take over. It's a pretty wild concept.
It definitely challenges the traditional view of Jesus.
And then it goes on to suggest that the origins of Christianity can be traced back to Paul, originally known as Saul, who, after a sunstroke, basically invented this new religion by borrowing from existing religious rituals and even pagan beliefs. It even claims that the New Testament was written by Greek scholars under Paul's direction, incorporating elements of the Mithraic religion.
Wow. It's basically saying that the whole story of Christianity is, well, a fabrication.
Yeah, the infinite Perspectus flat out states that the conventional understanding of Jesus in early Christianity is a badly warped, sadly distorted, and completely malpracticed history.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It also reinterprets the Battle of Armageddon, not as some future apocalyptic event, but as this ongoing internal struggle that we're all facing as we try to evolve towards these higher spiritual realms.
It's like saying that the real battle isn't happening out there in the world, but within ourselves.
And it goes on to describe the principle of survival of the fittest as the fundamental law operating on Earth, this constant process of refinement and evolution guided by the infinite creator.
So it's like we're all part of this grand experiment, constantly being challenged and pushed to evolve towards higher levels of consciousness.
And the infinite Perspectus is very clear that things like subconscious differences, mental illnesses, even physical ailments can't be fully understood without considering the influence of our past lives.
It's like saying that our current life is just one chapter in a much larger story, and to truly understand ourselves, we need to look at the whole picture.
It contrasts this, what it calls constructive evolution, with the more simplistic metaphysical ideas that are often taught in, churches and other religious institutions.
Hmm.
It emphasizes the importance of a scientific understanding of evolution to unlock the future.
It's like it's saying that we need to move beyond blind faith and dogma and embrace a more rational, scientifically informed approach to spirituality.
And the book gives its own interpretation of the second coming of Christ. It's not seen as the literal return of Jesus, but as the point when an individual's psychic anatomy, guided by their superconsciousness, becomes the dominant force in their life. It's like saying that Christ returns not in the flesh, but within ourselves as we evolve towards higher levels of consciousness.
It's a pretty radical reinterpretation of one of the most fundamental beliefs in Christianity.
And the infinite Perspectus is very clear about its purpose. It explicitly states that it aims to debunk various religious aspects of life and free people from the idea that our current material existence is the be-all and end-all.
It's challenging the whole notion that this physical world is all there is, and encouraging us to see ourselves as part of something much vaster and more interconnected.
It also emphasizes that the infinite creator isn't some separate entity, but the very principle and substance of all life. So it's not about worshiping a distant God, but about understanding and connecting with this underlying principle that permeates everything.
It's a more holistic and inclusive view of the divine.
The infinite Perspectus acknowledges that it's natural to resist unfamiliar ideas.
Hmm.
It attributes that resistance to what it calls ego-deflation, and it encourages those who grasp these more advanced concepts to be patient with those who are still operating from a more limited perspective.
It's a reminder to be compassionate and understanding in our interactions with others, especially when it comes to matters of, spirituality and belief.
It encourages everyone to seek out widening horizons and embrace the infinite as the core concept in their lives. This, the book suggests, will inevitably lead to questioning conventional norms and even reevaluating our own past beliefs. It even goes so far as to say that there is no truth in this or any other form of material life, because our understanding is limited by our earthly experiences and emotions.
It's like saying that we need to constantly be challenging our assumptions and pushing beyond the boundaries of our current understanding.
And the book makes it clear that pure philosophy alone is not enough. It suggests that all these philosophical systems and religious doctrines are just temporary aids on our evolutionary journey, relevant only at a particular stage of development.
It's like saying that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to spirituality. We need to find what works for us at each stage of our growth.
The infinite Perspectus also talks about the dangers of spiritual awakening without proper guidance. It suggests that people on the verge of, a major breakthrough might actually experience mental and emotional disturbances that could be misdiagnosed as, mental illness or just eccentric behavior.
It's a reminder that spiritual growth can be a challenging process, and it's important to seek guidance and support along the way.
It also emphasizes that we're all part of this continuous flow of consciousness, this grand cycle of regeneration orchestrated by the infinite. And it suggests that our earthly relationships are often based on, these kind of superficial emotional values, and that the natural progression of life involves those relationships evolving and making way for new connections.
It's a reminder that change is a constant in life, and that even our closest relationships are subject to that change.
So that's the introduction to the infinite Perspectus. It's a lot to take in, but it sets the stage for some really fascinating ideas. And we'll be back after the break to explore those ideas in more depth as we dive into the outro of this book.
It's a wild ride, and it only gets wilder from here.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the infinite Perspectus.
Now, picking up where we left off, the book takes a pretty deep look at the concept of astral influence. It talks about the Battle of Armageddon, not as some future apocalyptic event, but as this ongoing internal struggle we all face against unseen forces that are trapped to hinder our evolutionary progress.
It even describes these astral beings as inhabiting these lower astral worlds, and suggests that they're constantly trying to manipulate and influence us through, things like gossip, negative suggestions, even subversive tactics.
It's like a kind of psychic warfare going on behind the scenes, and the book claims that these astral beings are often found in positions of influence, in churches, temples, governments, even in our own social circles. It's a pretty unsettling thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's like saying we're constantly bombarded by these unseen influences that are trying to keep us stuck in lower states of consciousness. And the book emphasizes that to really connect with those higher dimensions, we need to develop an objective understanding of infinity, not just using it for personal gain or letting our own biases distort our perception.
Right. It's about seeking genuine wisdom and understanding, not just trying to manipulate the universe to get what we want.
And the Infinite Perspectus also talks about this reciprocal relationship between higher and lower consciousness. It suggests that these highly evolved beings in higher dimensions are constantly radiating positive energy down into the lower realms. It's like they're providing a kind of a spiritual boost for those who are attuned to that higher frequency.
Yeah, and it cautions us against relaying those negative influences from the lower astral worlds into our own lives. Things like jealousy, hatred, all those destructive emotions that can really poison our experience.
It's about being mindful of the energy we're putting out into the world and making sure it's coming from a place of, love and understanding.
Exactly. And the book goes on to discuss the concept of polarity, the interplay between positive and negative forces. It argues that even though negative experiences can seem, bad on the surface, they actually serve a purpose in our evolution.
It's like saying that darkness is necessary for us to appreciate the light.
Right. And it suggests that every conscious act we perform, every decision we make, creates a ripple effect that extends throughout the entire universe. So in a way, we're all interconnected, and even our smallest actions have the potential to impact the whole.
Now, one of the most intriguing parts of the Infinite Perspectus is its reinterpretation of what it calls the return of the Savior, or messianic concept. It argues that this isn't about some literal figure coming back to Earth, but rather a kind of personal awakening, what it calls the birth of the Spirit, which occurs when we connect with the principles of Unarius. And it describes this experience as being pretty intense, even potentially involving physical and emotional sensations.
It talks about people feeling like their body is coming apart, experiencing rubbery legs, having these uncontrollable crying spells.
Wow, that sounds intense.
But the book suggests that these are all signs of progress, that it's the power of Unarius breaking through those old patterns and limitations.
It also completely rejects the traditional Christian idea of the begotten Son, implying a literal sexual act by God. It calls that a pretty unrealistic concept that appeals to, well, let's just say less developed minds.
It's like saying that's a very primitive way of understanding the creation process.
And it emphasizes that our connection with the infinite is determined by our own level of understanding, always mediated through what it calls the superconscious self.
And it argues that the traditional religious interpretation of this superconscious self as, the personal being of Jesus has actually disconnected people from a true understanding of Christ and the infinite.
The book suggests that this misinterpretation leads to the belief that we're all born in sin and that we need to be saved through some kind of external intervention.
It's like saying that we've been taught to see ourselves as inherently flawed and powerless, instead of recognizing our own inherent divinity.
The Infinite Perspectus argues that our most fundamental characteristic is the desire for survival, and this leads to procreation as a way to envision, a kind of continuation of life and escape from the fear of death.
Right. It's like saying that we're so terrified of the unknown that we cling to anything that gives us a sense of permanence, even if it's just the continuation of our genetic line.
And the book suggests that these deifications of salvation are really just attempts to alleviate that fear of death and the pain of our past experiences. It's like we're trying to create a comforting illusion to shield ourselves from the harsh realities of existence.
And it argues that true salvation, true liberation, comes from understanding the process of reincarnation and the interconnectedness of all life. It's about seeing ourselves as part of this grand cycle of evolution, constantly growing and expanding our consciousness.
And that brings us to the concept of karma. The Infinite Perspectus presents a pretty different interpretation of karma than what we typically see in Eastern religions. It emphasizes that karma isn't about punishment or reward, but rather the residual effect of our past actions playing out in the present.
It's like saying that we're constantly reaping what we've sown, not in some kind of, cosmic payback scheme, but as a natural consequence of the energy we've put out into the universe.
And the book encourages us to really look at our current life and honestly assess whether we're truly progressing or if we're still being held back by these negative patterns from the past.
It's a call for self-reflection and honesty. It's about taking responsibility for our actions and understanding how they're shaping our present reality.
The Infinite Perspectus even suggests that religion itself can be a form of karma, an obsession that keeps us trapped in cycles of belief and dogma.
It's like saying that we need to be careful not to let our beliefs become prisons, to stay open to new ideas and ways of understanding the universe.
And the book also talks about the concept of judgment. It argues that when we judge others, we're actually setting in motion these harmonic waveforms within our own psychic anatomy.
It's like saying that every judgment we make is a reflection of our own internal state.
And it suggests that true equality doesn't really exist in our current society. It's more about striving to align our consciousness with the outside world, to understand and accept those differences without letting our emotions get in the way.
It's a really challenging concept, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded by messages about equality and fairness. But the Infinite Perspectus suggests that true progress comes from understanding and transcending those differences, not just trying to erase them.
It also criticizes our current education systems for focusing too much on rote learning and conformity, instead of teaching us about the fundamental aspects of life and these metaphysical principles that can help us evolve.
Yeah, it's like we're being taught how to be good little cogs in the machine instead of being encouraged to think for ourselves and explore our full potential.
And the Infinite Perspective doesn't shy away from acknowledging the destructive potential that exists in the world. But it argues that we shouldn't let those negative influences define our experience.
It's about recognizing that those things exist, but choosing not to let them dominate our consciousness.
And it offers a pretty fascinating perspective on human psychology, suggesting that many of our emotional issues stem from insecurities and unresolved traumas from past lives. It even uses the example of physical posturing, how some people are loud and boisterous while others are quiet and withdrawn, as a way of compensating for those underlying insecurities.
It's like saying that our personalities are shaped by our experiences, not just in this life, but across multiple lifetimes.
And the book is very clear that these issues are something we need to confront and overcome. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, everyone has problems. It's about taking responsibility for our own healing and growth.
And it emphasizes that the first step is to become aware of our reactions and emotions, to really examine where they're coming from and how they're impacting our lives.
The Infinite Perspectus goes on to talk about the human anatomy in a very different way, describing it as this complex system of energy waves and electronic constituents. It even uses the example of identical twins to illustrate this point, suggesting that their genetic similarity is due to a kind of a resonant frequency between their psychic anatomies.
It's like saying that we're not just physical beings, but also energy beings, and that our physical form is just one expression of that underlying energy.
And it uses this analogy of a superheterodyne radio to explain how consciousness works. It suggests that our psychic anatomy functions through these oscillating waveforms that interact with each other to create a kind of a beat frequency, which stores our memories and experiences.
It's a pretty complex idea, but it basically suggests that our consciousness is like a radio receiver, constantly tuning into different frequencies of experience.
And the Infinite Perspectus goes even further, suggesting that our psychic anatomy is a kind of mirror of the entire universe, containing within it the potential for infinite creation and evolution.
It's a really mind-blowing concept, but it aligns with the book's overall message that we're all part of something much vaster than we can possibly imagine.
And it concludes by emphasizing that understanding these electronic potentials and the regenerative process is essential for improving our lives and creating a better future. It's about recognizing that we're not just victims of circumstance, but powerful creators who have the ability to shape our own reality.
And it cautions us against trying to manipulate these forces without proper knowledge, suggesting that true happiness and fulfillment come from understanding and aligning ourselves with the principles of the universe.
Well, there you have it, The Infinite Perspectus. It's a challenging book, definitely not for the faint of heart, but it offers a truly unique perspective on the nature of reality and the potential for human evolution.
It's a book that really makes you think, and it definitely leaves you with more questions than answers. But I think that's the point. It's not about giving us all the answers, but about inspiring us to explore these mysteries for ourselves.
And that's what Occult Archives is all about. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of your own understanding.
We'll see you on the other side.
Take care.